obviously that record's not good enough. There's no hiding it. It is what it is, like everything in this sport. Everything's left on the field. Everybody knows what is every week. That record's that record. And like I said, it's not good enough. We're going to self-reflect and make it better. I do have patience. I'm just not – my reputation away from this game is one for extreme patience. There's no reason why that doesn't, come here too. It does. Now, that patience comes with good performance and things that you want to see progress being made on different aspects. And as I said, I would like to have somebody here for 20, 30 years. I'd like to have somebody that would say eulogy at my funeral in 30 years. Okay, maybe it's 40 years, I hope. But that's what I'd like to have.
I'm just like, this dude right here. I mean, I just don't even know what to say with that, to say about that. That's David Tepper, the owner of the Carolina Panthers. We're talking about the Panthers today because, one, they have the worst record in football. I maintain the Patriots are the worst team in football, but the Panthers have the worst record at 1-10. And they now have an interim coach for the second year in a row because Tepper, after 11 games, fired Frank Reich. And so to help us understand, to help us psychoanalyze the Carolina Panthers, we got Sheena Quick. You're all over this, Sheena. First of all, how do you explain this latest move? Because even for the Panthers and struggling and not getting what they expected out of Bryce Young, et cetera, this seems to be a bit impulsive. How do you explain this move?
He's embarrassed. The Panthers sit at 1-10. You kind of sold the farm to go up to 1 and grab Bryce. So you have no first round pick, which a lot of people are like, yeah, you traded up just to end up earning the first round pick the following season. But of course that goes to Chicago. I think at 1-10, he had to do something. He had to show I don't know if this move was just performative. I mean, it's a hell of a swing because I was expecting a position coach to go first. I'm not surprised that there's been firings, but I didn't think he was going to swing for the fences like that. I didn't think Frank Reich was going to make it past season 1, but as the losses mounted up, we didn't see any personnel changes. This team was getting worse every week. There's no improvement, no light at the end of the tunnel. So I guess he figured, to cut his losses early instead of letting it linger like he did with Matt Rule.
Sheena, I want to ask you this, looking at this team right now. I mean, sure, Frank Reich, it did not go well this year. No one's denying that. But I think a huge problem that has trickled down to Bryce's struggles as a young player is this roster. And they've had their fair share of injuries. No one's denying that. But it's a roster that's in easily the bottom third of the league. And that might be even being polite right now. Do you look at there being any kind of shakeup or at least questions now being asked about the guys that are in charge of, constructing this entire roster that's failed them?
That's what was supposed to happen today. And we got maybe 6 questions in, 7 questions in. Everyone was looking around the auditorium like, is that it? Even David Tepper seemed a little bit shocked that they were ending the presser when they did. It was right at 10 minutes. And then a journalist was able to get his question about Bryce versus CJ Stroud in at the last minute. And that ended up being 14 minutes. But I think that the fan base, the media that covers this team, everyone needs answers. And I don't think that today's press conference did anything to answer any of those questions. A large portion of it was spent talking about the events that were brought to Charlotte. Even talked about Messi coming to Charlotte, bringing soccer to Charlotte and concerts, everything but the Carolina Panthers and what you have to do to improve this team today. Because again, you don't have that first round pick next season. You have a couple of stars on the defensive side that you have to get ready to pay this offseason. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen to Scott Fitterer. And unfortunately, we didn't get any answer or any inclination or any type of direction, hint, or anything of that nature today, which was probably the most disappointing part of this press conference.
All right. Maybe the most disappointing point of the press conference for me as an outsider looking in is a journalist not being able to ask a question. So according to Scott Fowler, columnist for the Charlotte Observer, he sat in the front row. Sheena sat up in the front row, right here in the front, raised his hand, was right, hey, me, pick me. And they would not take his question, which suggests, not even suggests, I mean, look, you know what happened. Scott Fowler wrote a column. Scott Fowler wrote a column before. And he said, you know what? David Tepper fired Frank Reich, but he should fire himself. David Tepper read the column, and he probably went to somebody and said, look, we ain't dealing with this dude. You make sure he doesn't have a chance to embarrass me. He doesn't have a chance to answer a question. So they wouldn't take his question. Now, I got to say this. I'm always on the side of the media. Look, the media, dealing with the media and having that healthy exchange is good for everybody. Even the subjects, they don't understand that. They try to, they want the soft coverage. Hard coverage helps you, and it helps us. But beyond that, you know what I would have done, Sheena? I just would have
yelled your question out anyway.
Don't call on me. Don't call on me.
That's what the journalist did at the end. That's what the journalist did at the end. You know how sometimes they'll preface it with like, okay, this will be the last question. We didn't even get that warning. You know, Joe Person from The Athletic asked the question. And as soon as, well, I don't even know if Joe was the last person. I feel like Joe was the last person. If not, someone asked the question. And we weren't told until David Tepper finished that answer was up. That was the last one. And we were all kind of like, what? So Brett Jensen was able to still squeeze his question in there. And, you know, David Tepper did accommodate him and answer that. But I definitely feel Scott Fowler on this. This is not the beginning of the Scott Fowler, David Tepper beef. Like when he fired Matt Rule and addressed the media, he told Scott then, he said, listen, Scott, I read your column and you should know better. So the Tepper and Fowler beef isn't new. It's something that has kind of reached a boiling point today, it seems like, with him being iced out. But the explanation given, because a lot of us had our hands raised and were not called on when David Tepper was speaking, but the answer we were given was that every outlet that raised their hand was able to ask a question. And there was someone else from The Observer. There was someone else from The Observer that asked a question, so that covered the base of The Observer being represented today. That's the explanation that was given.
Bush League. It's Bush League. You want to be a major franchise. You want to run with the big dogs. You can't perform like that. Yeah, Connor, can you imagine in New York City? Hey, David Tepper in New York City. I'm sorry, we've already answered. We've answered one post question. No, we already answered that. Like, come on, you ready? Oh, we already heard from the fan. That's enough. You can't do that. You just can't get through with that. So I'm wondering.
Well, what's more jarring is that the Charlotte Business Journal was able to ask a question. That's someone that does not cover this team. That's someone that's not in the locker room. That's someone that, you know, for all intents and purposes, I was surprised that they were even there. But it was egregious to be able to just kind of witness that, where they were able to get their question in and Scott Fowler wasn't, and he was sitting right there in the front row.
That really is, Sheena. That just tells me they're lacking awareness, and that falls all the way from the top down, because obviously there's, you know, a message being sent from the top down to the PR staff of, you know, who might be getting questions in, or just saying, hey, you know, this is who's here every day. And that's not, listen, you brought up the point, Holly, like here in New York, but everywhere, like you're not going to win that war. You're just kind of you're sparking the fire even worse. Now this is dragging out where there's obviously a reporter very upset with his relationship with the team. And instead of being able to squash that or answer his question, or at least have an adult conversation before or after, now it's public. Now it's on Twitter. Now it's in a tweet. Everybody's going to be responding to it. And I'll say this, you know whose side nobody will be taking, the public won't be taking? It's Tepper's. And
David
the bullseye,
Tepper.
unfortunately. Yeah, exactly, Sheena. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
I wonder,
it
both of
was
you.
disappointing.
Yeah, and tell me, like, who would be a good head coach? And I want to hear from both of you on this one. Who'd be a good head coach for the Panthers, realistically? Who would do
that's
a
kind of
good
loaded.
job in this role? Yeah,
that's
go ahead.
a little loaded.
Good.
It depends on David Tepper's involvement. He said today that, you know, he gets a lot of flack for being too heavily involved in the football operation side of things. But he said that, you know, when it comes to staff question or staff decisions and roster decisions, that he doesn't even vote on that stuff until the end. He says he comes in as the quote unquote last piece. So it depends on how he's going to approach this coaching search, what he's going to do at GM, because I think that the GM and head coach should be in tandem. And he has not done that during his tenure. He fired Ron Rivera, kept Marty Herney, hired Matt Rule, fired Marty Herney, hired Scott Fitterer, fired Matt Rule. So he has never had just a complete clean sweep. I do think that it could be an attractive job, and what would attract people to that job is the opportunity to work with Bryce Young and those young stars over on the defensive side of the field. But it just depends on David Tepper having some patience, which this move today, like you said earlier, screams impulse moves. But he said that he has actually, away from the game of football, known to be a very patient person in the other aspects of his business life, and that his patience is tied to good performance, and he just simply has not had that in his coaching hires. So I can't even answer who would be a good head coach, because it depends on how they're going to be able to gel with David Tepper and whether he's going to have his hands in the cookie jar or not.
Sheena, you make a great point about the lack of alignment with the GM and the head coach and timelines. I mean, I've seen that throughout my career here in New York. It's been a big problem for the Jets at different times. You got to find a way to align the GM and the head coach to make them lockstep so the roster is in line with what the coaching staff needs. And that's clearly something the Panthers are lacking, which is going to be really interesting for the future for Scott Fitterer. But Holly, to answer your question, it feels like owners always go a different direction from what just failed them, right? They've tried the culture builder with Matt Rule. They've tried, obviously, the quarterback whisperer with Frank Reich. I mean, maybe they look at a guy like Dan Quinn, who's a big-time players guy. He's taken a team really, really far. He's a defensive mind. He's been able to hire an offensive staff to supplement his shortcomings with an offensive staff before that'll help Bryce. I mean, that's a guy that's been a hot name in coaching cycles. He's decided to stay with Dallas, but he's going to take another job soon, and he's a little bit different than what Tepper's had in recent years.
That's really interesting. A lot of the fans wanted Ben Johnson. But that is an interesting approach, because Frank Reich was the only offensive-minded head coach in franchise history. That was the very first offensive-minded hire, and that was the reason that was given that Steve Wilkes wasn't able to retain the head coaching job after doing such a good job as the interim on the back end of last season.
Well, it's funny here, because when the Panthers hire that next coach, that coach will be the 7th under Tepper. Tepper took over in 2018, so that's going to be 7 coaches in 6 years for the Panthers. And the irony here is that David Tepper was a minority owner in Pittsburgh. So that's 7 coaches for the Panthers in 6 years. The Pittsburgh Steelers have had 3 coaches in over 50 years. They've had 3 coaches in the last 54 years. And one of those coaches is Mike Tomlin. So I wonder, as I try to encourage, as we end this conversation, I want to encourage the Panthers as we look forward to what could be. The Steelers have done a very good job and a very intentional job, Connor, of thoroughly investigating, thoroughly interviewing available candidates. They usually hire a young coach. So Chuck Noll was hired in his 30s. Bill Cowher was hired in his 30s. Mike Tomlin hired in his 30s. They know they will struggle at some point. They're like, we good. We got your back. We got a front office structure. We're usually not going to trade our first round pick. We're going to use that. We're usually not going to spend lavishly in free agency. We got a system. We got you. Go ahead and do your thing. And Connor, it's kind of working for Mike Tomlin and the Steelers, isn't it?
It really has. I mean, Tomlin is a guy that just never has a losing season, even when the roster isn't where it needs to be. He finds a way to scratch out games. He hires a great staff. When he loses guys, he can replace them. When guys don't get the job done, like we saw with Matt Canada, it's time for them to go. And I think it all starts, Holly, with them being such a stable organization, right? You look at the Steelers, and that starts with ownership. It does. And they have patience. They understand what works. They understand how to connect certain GMs with certain coaches, and they build a culture there that it doesn't fall apart when one guy leaves or they lose a player. It is absolutely the organization that is the culture, and that's headlined by Mike Tomlin, who it feels like it's unbelievable. This guy's never been coach of the year. It really blows my mind. I think this is truly the year.
Yeah,
he doesn't even
crazy.
get votes to the top 3, by the way. That's the more jarring stat in that. I think the way the Steelers schedule is laid out and what he's done with this team, with Kenny Pickett under center, I think this is finally the year for Mike Tomlin that he gets that recognition.
Sheena, I think I'm just going to call it. I don't know how it's going to happen. It's going to be weird. When they clinch it, it's going to be weird. I think the Steelers are going to win the AFC North. All respect to Baltimore. I said all respect to Cleveland. I think the Steelers, who are a game behind Baltimore yet, have a victory over Baltimore where they stole it from them. I mean, Baltimore outplayed them for 59 minutes of a 60-minute game, and the Steelers won that game. So I think the Steelers are going to win the North. But when you look, Sheena, at Pittsburgh and the stability and contrast it with what you cover daily, what do you think and what do you see?
One of the things that pops out, I know it's been kind of circulating around the circles. I have not been able to confirm this. I don't know if Coach Tomlin would confirm it, but they said that when David Tepper was in Pittsburgh, he was trying to get Mike Tomlin out the paint. I don't know how true that is. That would be very interesting if that were true and if that actually did happen. But it's like you said, even when the roster isn't quite where it needs to be, he's able to restructure his game plan, his schemes, and everything else to fit who he has. And that's something that we saw the Panthers struggle with just in this early season. That goes again with the GM and the head coach alignment. You got one GM that's wanting to play smash mouth football and has been successful at it at the end of last season. Then you have another coach that comes in here with Frank Reich this season saying, hey, that's not our brand of football. They won with that brand last year. For whatever reason, I'm not doing it this year. And with that problem, you have personnel and scheme fits where you have an offensive line that's a power blocking offensive line that can't protect Bryce Young in pass protection. And that's what we're seeing, like the glaring difference. If you look at the stats and see how many times Bryce Young has been not only sacked, but hit and pressured, that's one of those things that I think in Pittsburgh, they have a plan and they stick to it. They don't abandon it really quickly. And they make sure that they bring people on board that are in tandem, not compliance, I'm sorry, but in agreement with where things are going. Everybody's in one direction instead of this guy wants to do this scheme, this guy wants to do this one. He wants to do a 3-4, but the GM signed these free agents. And that's what you're seeing in Carolina. There's a complete disconnect in all three phases of the game. Special teams are doing well. When the defense is playing well, the offense can't score. When the offense is playing well, the defense can't stop a nosebleed. And until they get someone that's in line and has the same set of goals and the same trajectory and timeline on how quickly they want to complete those goals, we'll continue to see a franchise that's just a complete disconnect, and that's showing itself now in a 1-10 season.
Well, Sheena, when the Panthers hire a coach, when they finally get a coach, we'll have you back on, and we can talk about the new guy who I mentioned yesterday to Michael Smith. The new guy probably should be the old guy. Hey, I think Steve Wilks might take the job.
I don't think he's going to take a big head text from the Panthers. I could be wrong. I don't know if Steve Wilks is going to answer a hey big head text from David Tepper. The culture would love it.
You don't think so?
The fan base would love it. I don't think he's going to take the hey big head text.
Really? Okay.
I don't.
All right.
I mean, he can prove me wrong because it was fun when Wilks was here. It was a blast. They were protecting the Bang. They played it. It was just a different atmosphere. The fans were excited. Like you said, a culture builder.
Yes, that's the guy. I saw that record. I saw David Tepper's record. All those coaches, and only one coach was at 500. And that was your interim coach.
In 12
Steve
games.
Wilks.
That's crazy, right? That's crazy. In 12 games. That's crazy.
All right, Sheena, great stuff. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks,
Anytime.
Sheena.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, thank you for watching Brother from Another. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, go ahead and do that now. Don't forget, you can catch us 3 to 4 weekdays on PeacockTV.com and on Sirius XM Channel 85.